Hi, thank you for joining us. This is Roger Craver, the editor of The Agitator, and I'm here with Kevin Shulman, the CEO of DonorVoice. Kevin is the director of this study that was undertaken on retention for the Agitator readers and for the fundraising community generally. Before we get started, a couple of procedural things. There are 2 points in this presentation, this discussion, that you can ask questions, so don't hesitate to send your questions in on the chat line as we go through it, and we will cover as many as we can. If we don't get to everything, we'll try to get back to you individually. Secondly, I want to thank a group of pros who worked on this with us. Katja Andreessen over at the Network for Good, Ken Burnett, the author of Donor Relationship Management in the UK, Fraser Green at Good Works in Ottawa, Canada, Tom Belford, the co-editor of The Agitator, Mark Rovner, who is a partner in Sea Change Strategies, and to Mark Phillips in the UK, to Jeff Brooks out in Seattle, the folks who have written and talked a lot about retention and donor loyalty over the years. Adrian Sargent, our thanks to you also. We set out to challenge one premise, that retention is dependent on donor attitude, and donor attitudes ultimately determine what the donor does vis-a-vis an organization. But those attitudes are influenced by what an organization does with or to those donors, and so we set out to isolate those factors and to see if we could create indexes or scoring systems to look at retention. Everyone in this session knows how important retention is and how troublesome it has been over the last 6 years, and it's not getting any better. So it's time to do something about it. So let me turn it over at this point to Kevin Shulman, and we'll get started. Kevin?
Great. Thanks, Roger. Good morning, everybody. And as Roger mentioned, we have a couple sort of hard stops in here where we'll pose, give us a moment on the logistics side to review the questions that have been typed in, and we'll try to address some of those. All of this will be posted and accessible on a website tomorrow, and we can send out a link to that blog. And with that, let me just jump into this. This will probably run about a full 90 minutes. Hopefully everyone can stay tuned and join us for the full session. As you see here, and as Roger mentioned, just a basic simple premise with this whole project, and it was around the notion of donor attitudes. The methodology quickly, and again, there's plenty of detail available in the full report and on the website, but briefly, 2 different studies were conducted. One was a national survey, national in the U.S. We have plenty of folks from Canada and the UK joining us. We appreciate them logging in at off hours here. The national study was 1,200 recent frequent cause donors, cause-based donors, meaning they were giving to something other than or in addition to their religious institution. So the results that we're going to see here, the vast majority of the results are from that national survey. However, there was a second study conducted in parallel with the national survey where we had 12 participating organizations, all nonprofits of various sort of sizes and sectors, who provided us with email lists. And for those email donors, or those donors for whom they had email address, they also gave us transactional data. And our singular purpose with the short survey that we conducted among those folks, the house file donors, was to demonstrate the linkage, math-based linkage between this thing that we measure around donor attitudes called commitment, plenty of that as we get into this, and actual behavior. So the national study, we have self-reported giving, and that's a fairly reliable indicator or proxy for actual giving, but we wanted to have the gold standard, which is transactional data, and specifically we take a look at the linkage between this thing that we measure called commitment and recency, frequency, and monetary amount. So the RFM, that is the gold standard or the bread and butter of behavioral segmentation. So with that, let me move forward here. This whole premise kind of led to a theory and, oddly enough, a domino analogy. So if you'll indulge us for a moment, we want to play a short video that we think will provide some context for what we're about to discuss. Welcome to the DonorVoice domino theory of donor relationships, where cause meets effect. Every nonprofit has financial goals, and donor contributions that hopefully fulfill those goals, and donor behavior metrics that indicate likely giving, and lots of activity from operations to fundraising to marketing and communications that hopefully drive or influence those donor behaviors. But what about donor attitudes? Doesn't it stand to reason that how they feel and think about you impacts their behaviors and in turn their giving and your bottom line? Of course they do. And in fact, those attitudes are what your activities truly impact to create the right mindset, persuasion, and motivation to take the action. At DonorVoice, we've figured out the messy attitude part in the middle. We call it donor commitment. We know how to measure it and impact it. We also know which activities impact commitment and those that don't. The most important fact is that for every low commitment donor you stored to high commitment with the specific marketing, communications, and fundraising activities that impact it, you increase that donor's 3-year lifetime value 130%, meaning for every $100 you would have received over that period from an individual donor, you now get $230. To learn more about which of your organizational dominoes impact your donor commitment levels and to see the proof of its impact, we'll spare you the infomercial at the end of that video, but hopefully that provides some context on what we'll reference at a couple different points here, which is kind of the messy middle, and we're going to go into plenty of detail on how we define that, how we arrived at it, all that good stuff. But first, let us walk through quickly, because we're going to go into each of these in detail, what the theory that led to the project, which I described, and the 7.5 kind of big takeaways that we derived from it. So we have a math-based way to measure, score, and improve donor attitudes, and that's that messy middle part. We call it donor commitment, and as we'll demonstrate here on subsequent slides, we've proven it's a leading indicator of future behavior, meaning it correlates highly with self-reported giving, and in the case of the transactional databases, actual giving. We believe it's the missing link between fundraising, communications, and operations and your bottom line. As was referenced in the video, at least briefly, for every 1,000 donors that you move from high commitment to, or from low commitment to high commitment, you can expect $200,000 more in income. Importantly, also in development of this model, it had to be efficient. If it took 43 questions to measure the thing, forget about it. It's not particularly practical. This donor commitment score, which we will also go into more detail on, requires only 3 questions, and to address that question that may be burning in at least someone's head, we're going to give you those 3 questions as part of all this. So it's pretty darn quick, easy, and efficient to incorporate this measurement system into lots of different donor touch points. We believe that it can be very useful for benchmarking, tracking, and targeting, and have developed some tools to help do this. We'll actually show a video at the close of this presentation that illustrates one of those tools. Having a handy thermometer, a good leading indicator of what folks are going to do next based on kind of how they feel and think about an organization. Well, that's interesting, maybe useful, but it's a lot like one-hand clapping unless you have also identified and provided for an organization what they can do to affect it. I mean, remember, that's kind of the basic premise here in our view, is that the actions that an organization takes, a nonprofit takes, what you're really affecting are the donor attitudes, and those donor attitudes, how they feel and think about you, is what drives their behavior or lack thereof. And so understanding that the 87,000 things that you all do through the course of the day, whether it's communications, marketing, fundraising, or operations, it's a finite number of those that's ever going to matter as far as the donor is concerned. They don't have time, capacity, or inclination, even if they're extremely committed to you, to process everything that you throw at them. So they have filters. Information processing theory is kind of well-grounded and established. That's how people get through the day, is these sort of mental shortcuts and filters to put you into a box or into a place in their sort of mental landscape. And so identifying the elements that actually encompass that mental landscape is critical, because then you can focus on the things that really matter.
I might add, Kevin, that one of the fascinating things from my standpoint is at the agitator, we hear lots of advice from people to get thank you notes out quickly, don't get them out quickly, make them personal, don't make them personal. Newsletters are good, newsletters are bad, and what you've done here with this is isolate the key drivers, not everything, so that if an organization undertakes one of these studies, it can very clearly see what it's doing or not doing that would move these scores up.
And the other sort of necessary ingredient in all of this is that, I mean, we'll be the first to admit quantitative research, and we'll get into all the details on these key drivers. There are some limitations. I mean, it's necessary and it's important to have an empirical view of the world, but there also is the need for some experiential interpretation. And for us, that meant taking a look at these key drivers and saying, all right, what exactly does that suggest by way of specifics, ideas, tactics? How do you go about delivering on that key driver? Because handing it over in a fairly dull research report is, let's face it, it's going to wind up collecting dust. So one of the things that we've begun, and we'll illustrate it at the end of this, is a best practices idea bank that's key to or specific to each of the key drivers, and it's very specific. It's a lot of ideas. You don't have to do all of them, but in that idea bank, you're bound to find some things that make sense for your organization and that we believe are good ways to specifically go about executing on these key drivers. And this is a bit nuanced, but we think it's important, and we referenced it a bit earlier here. You're doing 87,000 things, and if we tell you 7 matter, you're not going to drop the 86,000 and change. But in terms of time, emphasis, and focus, we do think a recalibration is in order, and that recalibration on the material things that truly matter, that truly impact how the donor feels and thinks about you, and we're going to prove that this is a good measuring stick for all that. It can, in fact, reduce workload and expense for organizations. We love this graphic, so we're going to, come hell or high water, we were going to include it. So what is your relation status with your donors? And I expect a lot of organizations would respond with it's complicated. But, more importantly, you should step back and ask yourself, all right, but does it even matter, right? I mean, that's sort of the question we frame for ourselves. And this briefing is going to address that, and hopefully emphatically for you all answer the question as a yes. So we're going to cut to the end and just give away the ending here and underscore the math-based link between this thing that we measure, that we call commitment, which again is just how the donor feels and thinks about the organization. It is, in some circles, brand equity is a reasonable way to think about it. It is the strength of the attachment, the mental kind of attachment they have to the organization. So all we've done here, and this is from the national study, okay, so we did ask and get self-reported giving to organizations. So we took a look at the 3-year giving average, and then we broke it out between those who had high commitment to the recipient organization versus those who have low commitment to the recipient organization. And here you see the difference, $149 versus $344. That's, if you kind of aggregate that and roll it up and have a bit of an approximation, we're talking about for every 1,000 donors that you stored from low to high commitment, the expected return is $200,000. So this is, without question, all about donor retention, and that is what we are preaching. and there are lots of others who are adding to that choir, and we support all that's being said about the underscoring the importance of retention, all the cliches, but true cliches, that it costs far less to keep one than to bring a new one in. I mean, that is emphatically the case. We also felt it was important to provide a comparative look, because while what you saw on the previous slide might look impressive, this framework, this model has to perform better than alternatives, and there are plenty of alternatives out there, especially in the commercial sector, where we have spent time and where this model was originally applied, and we wanted to hold ourselves to that higher standard. And so what we've done here is to have that same delineation. We created a group of folks who scored highly on the given model, the given framework, and those who scored what we identify as low. And we have the commitment model here as the first column. There is a competing model out there in the public domain that's based, at least loosely, on some of Professor Adrian Sargent's published work, which by the way, we're huge fans of. I mean, we are singing off of the same hymnal sheet in every respect with much of what we've seen from Adrian Sargent's work. And this was an attempt to kind of have a private sector or a commercial model that reflected that work. Satisfaction is reflected here. This is something everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with, personally or professionally. This is a pretty well-established framework for measuring satisfaction levels with donors or consumers on the assumption that those with high satisfaction are going to show up again or give again. Favorability is a bit of a proxy from a lot of the brand models that are out there. This is those positive, affective sort of feelings towards the organization. And last but not least is willingness to recommend, which in the commercial sector has been hijacked I mean, use that term in a negative or derogative fashion, but there is a Harvard professor and a Bain consultant, Fred Reichheld, who has written several extremely popular business books. The Loyalty Effect was the first, and then The Ultimate Question. And his view was that the willingness to recommend, which they refer to as Net Promoter Score, some of you may be familiar with, was the ultimate question, the one question that you needed to ask. And he's been very successful with some commercial entities at selling that in at the corporate level. So we wanted to have that as another proxy. So what we've done here is take a look at that 3-year giving broken out by high-low segments across these 5 different frameworks. And then we look at the percentage difference between low and high giving, and that's reflected on the last line, the last row. So here you see that the commitment model clearly stands out as being demonstrably better at capturing what's really going on with giving. 131% increase between low and high giving versus lesser percentage change. We also want to hold out what we consider to be kind of the gold standard. And so this is data not from the national study, but from the 12 groups who provided us with transactional data. And so we conducted a separate parallel survey to the 120,000 donors, not all responded, of course, where we measured their commitment level to the organization that provided the data, and we also captured a couple other metrics that allowed us to replicate this competitor model based on Adrian Sargent's work. And now we've broken out the results. Again, we have high and low, so people who score high on commitment and low, people who score high on this competitor model and low. We take a look at recency, frequency, and giving amount based on the transactional data. So the recency of the high commitment donors in aggregate across the 12 organizations, 338 days. So they're in that 0 to 12 active, right? The people who score low in commitment are lapsed by some definitions, 453 days since their last gift. The difference between the two is 115. So we're doing a good job of discriminating on recency, meaning we're identifying people who are recent and are going to be identified as active in that 0 to 12 segmentation, and separating out folks who are lapsed. and you see the comparative piece here. Very little difference, in fact, between the recency for those people who score high in this model versus low. It's only 13 days. I mean, it's not doing a particularly good job of discriminating on recency. Everyone, whether you get a high score or low score, you're pretty much the same on recency. You see the overall mean for the sample is 389 days. Moving along to frequency, so this is the number of gifts, and this is for 2010, so the number of gifts received, again, in aggregate across the 12 organizations. And we see 3.94 gifts for those high in commitment versus 2.34 for a difference of 1.6 gifts in 2010 versus only less than 1 gift, 0.59 gifts for this competitor model. And last but not least, the dollar amount giving here, we see for 2010, those high in commitment on average gave $173, almost $174 versus almost $93 for a difference of $81 versus $29. It's worth pointing out that when we looked at some of the differences here for the specific organizations that participated, and I won't name names, of course, but there were some groups where the percentage difference was 300%. So they were doing an extremely good job of getting maximum share of wallet, maximum giving from those who had a strong connection to the organization. On the, conversely, on the flip side, there were several organizations where they were underperforming, probably not doing a good job of cultivation and getting maximum financial return from these folks who were extremely committed to the organization. Okay, so now that we've kind of given away the ending, and we thought it was important to demonstrate the linkage to the part that everyone really cares about, the ultimate metrics, which are those RFM giving metrics. So let's take a step back here and give you a little bit more detail on this relationship vernacular and certainly the commitment piece. Give me a moment here. I'm just checking questions to see if we're missing anything. Asking Roger to speak a bit louder. Okay, Roger can do that. All right. All right. So we're not going to spend a ton of time going through all the gory details of the theory. We do want to point out, and we can send by way of follow-up to those who have registered for this webinar, the link here, this whole PowerPoint will be available, so you can click on the link through it. But there is a white paper that will give you more than enough detail on relationship theory, which we didn't invent. Okay, I mean there's a lot of academics and practitioners who have spent a lot of time looking at this thing called relationship theory. The very quick primer is relationship theory was originally conceived to understand interpersonal relationships. So what is it that makes for a healthy relationship, be it a spouse, a friend, or a colleague? And then in the last 30 plus years, academics and eventually practitioners began to look at those underlying dimensions or constructs, those things that make for healthy interpersonal relationships, and said, boy, I wonder if this applies in a B2B context. So business to business was where they originally started looking. And then more recently looking at a business to consumer context, and really what we've done here is to look at it in a nonprofit to donor context. And the short answer is that those underlying elements that make for a healthy interpersonal relationship are present in all these other types of relationships. Okay, certainly not the same degree or intensity. No one loves a nonprofit the way they love their spouse, but the underlying elements are the same. And so that theory of the world is what underlies this whole model. And again, our sort of shorthand for the commitment piece is really the messy middle. It's that attitude part in the middle between what you do and what the donor does that we really feel as though we've figured out here. All right, so how do you go about measuring this? And if you haven't figured it out already, we're going to get more and more specific as we work our way through here. And these are the 3 questions required to measure and create the donor commitment score. And this is measuring the commitment to the organization. And a shorthand, but an important shorthand, and it's a little nuanced, but it's if you want to understand how we define commitment, we are capturing the level of motive or intent the donor has to maintain the relationship with the organization. Think about commitment you might have to your workplace or to a friend or to a colleague or to a loved one. It's that motive or level of intent that you have to maintain that relationship. The same thing that we're measuring here. These are 3 questions, and these 3 were not identified willy-nilly. This is a multi-year process where, again, this was applied in the consumer world first, and more recently here. We started originally with well over 100 different items and went through a rigorous kind of time-tested, battle-tested process for scale development. So these are not arrived at in some random haphazard fashion. No, you cannot switch them out. Yes, you need all 3 because it limits the predictive nature of the model up against those behaviors. So if you want to be able to discriminate on the recency and the frequency and the dollar amount the way those previous slides suggested, you need all 3. Importantly, the response to any of these individual questions is irrelevant. It's only when you collapse them into the index that you've captured the donor commitment score. And in referencing back to the relationship theory, this is some of the verbiage that you might see if you do any sort of Google search for relationship theory. You're going to see trust, which is really kind of the linchpin of a healthy relationship. It's the end state, the desired goal. Reliability is an important component, which is akin to satisfaction. There's definitely kind of an emotional or personal component to all of this that we're capturing. But these are the 3 items that you need to create a donor commitment score.
Kevin, when I first looked at this, I thought these questions are terribly simplistic. And you're asking someone if they're committed, you're going to get an answer. Yeah, I'm committed, aren't you? But having seen the results and seeing the way this correlates with their giving history, but I think there are probably some in this session that are saying, well, yeah, that's kind of an obvious question.
Yeah, no, and it's a little the important kind of, again, kind of nuanced point. When we labeled it commitment, we didn't start here. Okay, we've got a blue circle called commitment. What are the questions we ask? Oh, I know. I'm a committed donor, right? These were the items that resulted out of hundreds or hundred and change, and we arrived at these, and we were attempting to measure the underlying constructs. Trust could have been something that we labeled once we arrived at these 3. We could have called this the trust score, the donor trust score. Commitment and what we're capturing here is very akin to trust. So commitment was what the label we came up with only after we had arrived at the best 3 at measuring this underlying thing.
Great, thank you.
All right, so you've got all these measures and all these scores. Now, what the heck do you do about it? Well, of course, everybody likes a score. Everyone likes to see their name in lights, or perhaps not, depending on where one falls in the ranking. But it is a score allows you to track and measure and compare yourself, whether it's to a sector average, to a national average. What you see reflected here is from the national survey that we conducted, and this was really done to illustrate the ability to rank and rate organizations and to be able to also have some national standardized benchmarks so that for any organization that goes about doing this down the road, you've got some frame of reference and a comparative anchor point that's going to be useful. So we had 50 different, we would describe as big brands, sort of well-known brands. I mean, there's certainly some difference in the size vis-a-vis revenue if you look at this list. But what you see here is the donor commitment score, and then the average for these 50 is plotted right there. It's about a 70 or 71, I believe. And the important thing to see here is that you see a lot of spread, right? There's a lot of variance here. We go from 50 all the way up to 93. This is a 0 is theoretically the worst that you can do, and 100 is the best that you can do. So we're doing a good job at discriminating amongst these organizations, showing some difference in the strength of the donor connection to these organizations.
I want to emphasize, or maybe you want to emphasize, Kevin, this is not a favorability or a recognition type of ranking. It's not some brand ranking. This is a commitment ranking. This is how people who give to these organizations feel about the organization or organizations they're giving to.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, if you just peruse this list, and again, you'll have access to this. You don't need to study for it like you're cramming for a test here. There are some, relatively speaking, pretty small groups and lesser known groups, if you're thinking about kind of the general public, at the top of the list. Conversely, there are some pretty big brands and some large revenue brands, very well known, well established, near the bottom of this list. So you can be a very small organization and have extremely high commitment levels. And you can also be a very large organization who raises a ton of money with pretty weak commitment levels. Okay, so that's important here. This is not, in fact, a proxy for market share or just name ID. And the other thing that we've done, which we think is useful, is we do have, again, for those who want to start measuring and managing this thing called commitment and produce their own donor commitment scores, we have qualitative labels that allow you to give you some context and put yourself in a hierarchy here, so ranging from great down to poor. Okay. This is really to illustrate some of the analysis that is derived from the commitment model and the work that we will do going forward. So this is strictly illustrative, but this is a donor commitment brand map. So for those sitting out there, imagine that your organization is plotted here up against your competitive set. What we've done here is just sort of a convenience grab of some organizations that were reflected on that previous slide where we had sufficient samples. So this is only to show that your ability to sort of plot yourself in this kind of commitment map space. And this is really how donors think about these brands when it's through the lens of the filter of donor commitment. And so the ideal space is up into the upper right where you've got high commitment levels, and groups that are doing less well are going to be in the lower left. The other thing that we've reflected here that underscores the point we just made, we've reflected revenue size by the size of the bubble. Okay, and so you see this is certainly not, it's not correlated with revenue. So this is not a proxy for market share. Okay, plenty of big brands that are doing not particularly well among this sample. Remember, these are recent frequent donors who gave to these organizations, and they're not doing very well. So again, this is just illustrative, the type of brand level or organizational level mapping that can be done, just to give you some strategic sense of the landscape if it were you up against your competitive set is the way to think about it. And this is useful for strategic purposes, but really the next slide is where the rubber starts to hit the road a bit and becomes even more practical and tactical. So this is a donor commitment map. So we're not, at this point, the circles that you see plotted here, and again, this is in kind of donor commitment space, and we can provide details sort of offline for those who want it. We've looked at individual donors plotted into this space, and in this case, it's the Salvation Army from our national sample, just because we had a reasonable number of folks to illustrate what it looks like when you start to plot individual donors. And again, the place to be here is up in the upper right. So those are going to be the higher commitment folks, and if individual donors are down in the lower left, they've got a very weak kind of connection to the organization. The other thing that we've done here is a segmentation, and this is a statistical segmentation. So we didn't, arrive at this willy-nilly either. We segment based on the level of commitment to the organization using a couple different dimensions. And there are 4 different groups or segments that we identify here. The high commitment folks, and those are in the upper right, the blue. Potentials are the kind of the reddish maroon color. Vulnerable is orange, and then what we call transactional in the lower left, the blue. And then we have some basic demographics and kind of giving metrics for each of these 4 segments. And this is all from the national study. If this were done in a more custom fashion for a specific organization, we would have a lot more nuance and context and specificity around the defining of these segments. But we made use with kind of what we had in this national survey. We have age, and you can see that high commitment, 45 years old. This is to the Salvation Army in the last 3 years, gave $651. Contrast that with the transactionals who gave $216 over the last 3 years to Salvation Army. We had the percentage of these folks who gave or indicated they gave to a religious cause. You see 35% of the high commitment are giving to a religious cause versus 24% of the transactional. But what I want to draw your attention to are these 2 groups in the middle, potential and vulnerable. And if you look at them on standard demographic or giving metrics, they're virtually identical. both 50 years old on average. Both gave, and this is sheer coincidence, but almost exactly the same amount in the last 3 years on average, $487 for your potentials versus $488 for the vulnerables. So if you were slicing and dicing and doing a segmentation based on demos and financial metrics, these groups would get bundled together. And they're drastically different in terms of their commitment to the organization. Now, that hasn't, at this juncture, manifested itself in giving, but it will. And if they're treated the same, you've made a fairly significant strategic and tactical mistake. These are not the same donors when you think about their sort of mental commitment to your organization.
Kevin, let me italicize this, what you just said, because we're also historically familiar with RFM, and some organizations use demographic overlays, and consequently there's I think just an assumption that this is the only way to find donors. And in fact, as we've seen in other things we've been looking at, the RFM analysis, or the straight demographic analysis, will simply miss these people. So if you're, for example, focusing on a mid-level donor program, building one of those, or monthly giving program, you're going to overlook an awful lot of folks who have far more potential than other folks do.
And the one difference that we did find here, it's the last point, but it's worth reading, in fact. So what's one of the differences, and this is certainly not the only difference between the potentials and the vulnerables when it comes to the Salvation Army, but one of the differences, and it could very well be part of the cause, part of the reason that somebody's in potential versus vulnerable, is that 27% of the potentials since their last gift have had an experience or experiences that exceeded their expectations. Contrast that with 0% of the vulnerables who report an experience that exceeded their expectations since that last gift, and 14% say their experience fell short of expectations. So this is descriptive. It's not meant to suggest that that is mathematically, at least, the cause. But if we put on our sort of experiential and interpretation hat, you got to think it matters. It's part of the reason, right? Okay, so again, this is really illustrative of donor-level mapping that can be done, and we're not beating up an RFM at all. I mean, the absolute best way to make use of this, and it's certainly what we've done in the commercial space, is that this is combined with or augments or supports behavior-based segmentation, whether it's RFM or modeling, what have you. There's just an attitudinal component here that allows you to identify differences between donors, important differences, and as we've demonstrated, differences that will manifest into better giving down the road that you miss without the attitudinal piece. All right, so one of these natural breakpoints, we've got to give us a moment here to kind of peruse the questions. We'll try to address at least one or two of these.
While you're looking at those, Kevin, the first part of this was on the research part. Now, what follows once we handle some of these questions will be how this is applied, and the tools that have been created so far to do this. What do we have here?
Well, there's one question that kind of segues right back to what the point we just made. So we'll underscore it here. The question is there more of a statement. Interested in the different patterns between cash donors and recurring donors, or what gets referred to as sustainers. And yeah, absolutely. We don't have that on the national study. We will be able to derive some insight into that from the organizations that provided us with their transactional data. We haven't had a chance to sort of do that fine-tuned look yet, but you're right. That's an important. It's what we meant by using this to kind of augment behavioral segmentation. So of course you're going to want to look at cash versus credit card folks and understand the differences. There was a question here where I guess the need for clarification. They were looking at that RFM slide, kind of the gold standard was the heading, and there was we noted there was 338 days in recency for that high commitment donor, and yet they gave 3.94 gifts. So the recency was looking at the last 12 months, which includes most of 2011. and what we were reporting on for frequency and dollar amount was from 2010, so that explains the discrepancy there. A couple other questions. Will you show the last slide again later? I'm not sure when that question was posed, but probably not is the short answer. The longer answer is this deck will be available for folks who want it, so you can access any of the slides. There was one other question about access to that first video that we showed and how it might be nice to share with the board. And again, that video it will also be accessible either through this PowerPoint or separately on the same website we'll send the link to.
You're planning tomorrow to send everyone who's registered the deck or the research documents, the videos or links to the videos, all that.
Correct. Yeah, there'll be a copy of this PowerPoint. There's also an executive summary, so it's in Word, a Word document format that has some text around it, because we know the PowerPoint's kind of a lousy standalone. That said, we will have not tomorrow, but by this week, we'll have the full archive of this webinar accessible so that you can hear us kind of drone on. One last question we'll take here, and then we've got to move on. How were the questions asked? So yeah, both these surveys were done online. So there was an email invitation that went out, and then they participated in an online survey. All right, so in the interest of time here, let us move on. But again, we'll archive all those questions and address any that we missed. Okay, so as we mentioned, it's a little bit like one-hand clapping. It's an important hand. I mean, it's the measuring stick. We've indicated that it's more than a measuring stick. It's really a leading indicator of what's going to happen next. Who's going to stay and go? But what do you do about it? This gets referred to a lot in the market research kind of geeky world as key driver analysis. We'll continue to adopt that vernacular and of course, so a gratuitous picture. Again, we're going to kind of give away the ending here right up front, and then we'll go into some of the gory details. But we identified from 32 possible drivers, so a rather long laundry list, and more on that in a moment, the 7 that truly had a math-based, so model-based statistical impact on that messy middle piece, the commitment piece. And again, if you do these 7 things well, commitment goes up, and by extension, you begin to see better recency, better frequency, better dollar amount, better donor behavior. We won't spend a lot of time going through these. Again, this will be available. What you'll derive the most value from is having these 7 in the context of the idea bank or in supplement with the idea bank, meaning there will be specific ideas, tactics around each of the 7, ways that you can go about trying to deliver on these things.
Since most of the folks in this session are fundraisers, you'll be either pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised to learn that your communications folks have a big job here to do. Their attitudes are impacted by far more than fundraising appeals or telemarketing scripts. And as you look at this tomorrow or the next day in detail, you may want to be breaking down the silos and having some meetings inside your organization. Again, all this detail will come your way.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Several of these are in essence kind of message points, and lots of different ways that you can go about delivering on these. And of course, some of these can be delivered on simultaneously with one brilliant image. But remember, the communications, while you have a communications person perhaps in a marketing department, and you've got the digital people, and you've got your fundraisers, the donors world does not subdivide you into functional areas, okay? They get hit by and elect to pay attention to and absorb messages from a variety of places, regardless of who's responsible for it inside the organization. And so it will be a failure in execution and a great inefficiency if this is left to, all right, there's some messages that need to go into the newsletter and the annual report. No, this needs to cut across the organization to make sure that this is being done across all of those donor touch points. And some of these are not messaging. There are some operational elements here. Okay, so a little bit more detail now on this whole key driver piece, what the heck it's about. So this is very literally what we did as we set about drafting this national survey. We asked ourselves, all right, what is it under the organization's control? We don't want to talk about See, the trust in institutions is eroding because that's irrelevant if I've got to deal with meeting the number for 2011. Okay, what are the things that you actually control? And we looked at the different silos because we wanted to be exhaustive here. Cut across marketing, communications, fundraising, and operations that might, just our hypothesis, reasonable guess, experience, whatever, that might impact how the donor feels and thinks about us. So that was our first question, and that's roll up your sleeves and start producing a list time. Okay, nothing magic about it. From the list that we arrived at, and we had, again, some expert help here because the experience piece matters, knowing the fundraising space matters, knowing donors, at least tangentially matters. So we organized this laundry list of things that were possible drivers we thought might impact how the donor felt. Now, remember, we were doing this in a sort of global fashion with a national study. For individual clients, the list that would be arrived at would be highly specific. Now, some of these more global dimensions might be incorporated because they kind of cut across all organizations, timeliness of thank yous. There's nothing that's particularly proprietary when you talk about that timeliness component or personalization. But for an individual organization, your list would look a whole lot different, right? All of your specific messages, if you've gone through a branding exercise and you have brand attributes, other sort of marketing and promotional pieces, those sorts of elements could be, would and could and should be accommodated in this sort of a list. But here's the list that we arrived at in sort of this global fashion. And so for all the math phobic, we wanted to give you plenty of warning right off the bat. We're not going to go into too many details here, but we think some of the detail is important. So we fielded the survey, okay, and we got ratings on all 32 things, knowing two things. One, not all 32 are going to matter. There's no chance. The donor can't possibly process that many things to form their mental judgment of you and then make a decision to give or not give. So we knew that. We also knew that a lot of the things that we had in our list and that would ever go into any list of this sort are redundant when in the mind of the donor. So they don't, not only does not 32 things don't matter, they don't even see 32. Okay, a lot of these things sort of group together in their brain. So there's a technique that we use on the back end to group the 32 things together. It's basically a mental grouping that if the donor could actually do that task for us, and they couldn't, this is how they would see the world. So that was step one, was to group these things together based on what the donors thought was basically the same thing. Even if you have two different people performing those two different tasks and you place a high degree of importance and differentiation on it inside the organization, some of those things are not different as far as the donor is concerned. It all gets kind of put under the same mental bucket. Okay? This is an important piece that needs to get done on the back end for any sort of key driver analysis. So once you've done that grouping, you go through any number of kind of statistical models. We used regression in this case, and really the regression is asking, all right, which of these things actually matter to commitment, have a math-based link to a causal link to commitment. So that was the next step. And that is, in fact, how we arrived at the 7, okay? And we're reflecting these here. These are broken out into, they're separated a little bit with that little bit of space, a little bit of white space, into two groups. There's some details that we haven't shared here just in the interest of time on how we arrived at all this. But these are the 7. You've got some coefficients, which are the numbers that with the decimals. Those are directly from the regression model. And then to make it a little bit easier to interpret, there's some percentages here that can be interpreted and should be interpreted as magnitude of difference or importance. So not all 7 are created equal is the main summary takeaway here. Effectively trying to achieve the mission is, compared to these other 3, the most important at 48%. That is not a direct rating or percentage from the survey. This is just a way for us to provide an easier to interpret view on those coefficients. Okay? But again, the important summary point here is that not all these are created equal. Okay? The flip side to all this sort of analysis, and it's always instructive for individual client engagements, is to also take a look at what doesn't matter. So what didn't make the list? Take a look at those those mental groupings that we described, how the donor kind of organizes the world, and you begin to get a much more nuanced and important understanding of how the donor views the organization. Where are some areas where we may be putting a lot of time, money, resource, or at least mental energy that probably don't matter. We need to reevaluate that. So looking at what doesn't matter is also important.
By the way, a good point for board discussions and things. You can, I mean, I've sat in my years doing this, sat through an awful lot of meetings. Does the magazine matter? Doesn't it matter? Do all these things we send out really account? Does people read? Do people read this? All that sort of thing you can survey quite explicitly here and end some of these debates forever.
Although the person responsible for that magazine, that can be a pretty painful conversation. But we're nearing the end here, and we have another sort of break for questions. Let me just take a quick peek here and see if there's anything that's popped up since. How do you apply the scoring based on their answers? Isn't it subjective based on who is asking the question? I'm not sure I understand that question, but let me. We'll be sure to connect with whoever asked that offline and try to get some clarification, because I think there's an important point being raised there. I don't want to try to guess at it at this point. Is there a minimum size donor pool that an organization must have in order to make the results of the questions and data reliable, statistically meaningful? I suppose there are some extreme examples where we wouldn't have sufficient numbers, but importantly, the way that an individual organization would go about looking at this, there's really two worlds, right? There's your house file, and if it's a smaller organization or an organization who just frankly hasn't done a very good job of collecting email, it may be the case that you don't have sufficient numbers for us to get a large enough sample off of the house file. You all probably know your email response rates to other email-based marketing better than us. I can tell you on average it's pretty bad. Not that nonprofit's any worse than commercial, maybe even slightly better. But we're talking low single digits is what we would conservatively estimate on response rates. At a bare minimum, we'd want 300 responses. We'd be a lot happier if we had 500, 600, or 1,000 responses, so people can do the sort of reverse engineering on the math there. But the flip side is the acquisition universe, right? And that is, in some ways, what this national survey represents. It's a bit of a proxy for, in a aggregate kind of global fashion, acquisition. So these are recent frequent donors who give to cause-based groups, and in aggregate, they're going to show up on a whole lot of merge-purge lists. So there's that other audience, and for that universe, we make use of large consumer panels. So there are companies out there who are in the business of maintaining panels of consumers, and they number in the millions, and they're global, not just U.S.-based. People who have agreed to participate in regular survey research, and you can screen and target into those millions of consumers and get a very specific universe that, if desired, matches perfectly with your acquisition universe. So not just recent and frequent and cause-based, but affinity ties and age criteria, so that there's really no limit to our ability to sort of select in and target a universe for the acquisition side of the world. And in that case, we can get as many completes as needed. All right, so let's continue to move forward here. We're doing fine on time, so we'll certainly be done by noon, and probably a little bit sooner, if anyone's wondering. Oh, in fact, now it's time for the really practical stuff and some shameless plugs. That would just somewhat tongue-in-cheek. There is a video at the very end here. We mentioned it's a tool that we think is a very cheap, efficient, quick way to apply some of this, even for the smallest organizations, which was important to us. We wanted to have a way for even very small groups, I don't care how big you are, to begin to apply this in a meaningful fashion. So on the practical side, and this gets to the whole idea of the idea bank, I mean, we would be the first ones to acknowledge, when you look at that first key driver, Oh, I'm sorry, this is a different, well, any of these really. So, and recognize these would be more specific than what you see here because we were dealing with kind of a global need here, a semi-generic need with the national survey. But, all right, so driver number one, providing donors with a feeling they're part of an important cause. Well, you're going to be left, with, there's an interpretation need there. What the heck does that mean exactly? What do you do to go about delivering on that? And so this idea bank, and you've got a partial list here. It'll grow and expand and become more exhaustive and available, publicly and for free. Ideas, that's what they are. They're specific ideas, tactics, whatever you want, however you want to think about it, ways that you could go about delivering on this driver. And remember, the more the donor believes or thinks that they're a part of the important cause, the higher the commitment, the better the donor behavior. That's the whole domino bit here, right?
And by benchmarking this, meaning by doing a commitment survey to start, you can then measure the change in the commitment level as you apply different drivers. So it's designed to be self-steering in the sense that an organization can improve itself, or working with its consultants and copywriters and communications people can.
And you'll notice the idea bank, you've probably, if you're a consultant, you've put a list together like this probably 1,000 times for your clients. If you're an organization, you've thought about these things. So we're not reinventing the wheel. And in fact, we went out to the experts that were involved with this. This is where they played a pretty large role, because we want to make use of what others have done and tried and found to work or not work. So this is really kind of a clearinghouse of ideas, and most of these are going to be things you've already heard about, thought about, said, done. So that we just wanted to clarify there. We're not going to read these for certain, and we're also not going to show all of them. We'll have it accessible at a later date, but just to show you, give you some illustration of what we're talking about with the ideas here. Nothing fancy, but still important to put some specificity around all this. And again, the list of specific key drivers that we would find for any individual organization would by definition be more specific than what you see here, because it would be dealing with their world, not this kind of global world that we were dealing with. And the last bit here before we kind of close out, and because we've got a little bit of time, we'll take a look at the questions that have been posed and see if we'll have one more quick look at that and address any outstanding questions. But we want to show you one of these tools, and it is borrowed from or modeled on or based on kind of the commercial world, which the nonprofit sector gets in our view kind of unfairly dinged and when compared to the commercial sector on a lot of different fronts. One where it's not unfair is on collecting feedback from customers. In the case of the commercial side, I mean, there are all the big well-run companies, or even the small well-run companies, are doing a far better job, in our estimation, of soliciting feedback from their customers than is the nonprofit space in kind of in aggregate. And you saw, and it wasn't coincidental, but one of the key drivers was actually soliciting feedback from them. So we actually have data, proof that the donors are asking for this. It's one of the things you actually can increase commitment just by asking them for their feedback. They don't even have to give you feedback. The mere act of asking is going to increase their commitment levels. Remember, you're establishing that relationship. They get from the mere act of asking that this is a two-way street, that you care what they think, that they're part of all of this. Okay, the engagement gets turned around. Is a sort of the coin of the realm these days, and so this is all about that.
Kevin, at the agitator, Tom and I hear all the time from folks saying, we're not. Many other people may be raising money online. We're not, and we have this expensive website and what have you. Well, here is when you see this tool is a marvelous way for almost no money to increase or to at least add some ROI to a website.
Hi, my name is Kevin Schulman. I'm the of DonorVoice, and I want to introduce you to two online feedback tools that we've built to help nonprofits increase the level of engagement and commitment among your website and Facebook visitors. The commercial sector is way ahead of nonprofits when it comes to online engagement using feedback tools. And at this point, you might be thinking, so what? Well, we think there's 3 reasons that you should care. First, it's a fact that the mere act of asking for feedback increases the likelihood the donor will engage in key behaviors. This is just you asking for feedback, nothing else. Second, if the donor actually responds, and remember, you get return on investment just by asking, you get the opportunity to build the relationship and increase the donor's commitment to your organization. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get some good ideas for the organization along the way. Third, your organization spent a lot of time and money creating an online presence and building an audience. Isn't it time to at least try feedback tools to improve the return on that investment? Our 2 tools, the Survey Feedback Widget and the Idea Widget, deliver all this benefit in an automated, very low-cost fashion. Let's start with the Survey Feedback Widget. We've designed a closed-loop, automated process that includes measurement of each respondent's donor commitment level, more on that in a minute, and satisfaction with the website visit. Depending on the response, 1 of 4 highly responsive and appropriate emails is sent back to your constituent, and each message contains opportunities for more engagement. Let's take a look. Here we see a pop-up invitation triggered, in this case, by someone visiting the donation page, but it could also be triggered by a visit to any part of your website, or when the visitor is visiting. The visitor simply clicks yes to participate, or no to have the window go away. The survey appears directly on your site, and as you can see, it's very short and purposeful, and includes name and email capture, so it's a great incremental way to continually build your email list. The first 3 questions are from our commitment model, and they allow us to produce the donor commitment score, which is a proven predictor of future behavior. And lastly, there's an open-end comment field in keeping with the best practices in survey research and donor engagement. As soon as the respondent hits the submit button, the feedback screen goes away, returning your visitor back to the site. Next, this same visitor will receive a highly responsive and appropriate email tied to their feedback. For example, high commitment, high satisfaction donors are thanked and asked to recommend a friend. Here's a look at that email in my inbox. All the responses are captured in our back-end database, and this can either be integrated with your CRM or regularly exported and easily added to your donor database. The survey widget can be up and running in a few hours and costs less than a cup of coffee a day. This is not some do-it-yourself survey tool with lots of decisions to be made and staff time invested. Instead, it's an automated, closed-loop system based on a tested and proven model for donor engagement. In short, a system that yields enormous benefit from an audience who spend a lot of time trying to engage. Plus, you get incremental building of your email file, a donor commitment score for every respondent, a proven predictor of who will stay and go, and to be mentioned, more opportunity for engagement. Contact us to get started, and check out our other engagement tool, the DonorVoice Idea Widget. Again, we'll spare you the promotional piece at the end. The Idea Widget, we don't have the video here, just in the interest of time, but we can access that on the site as well. I believe that, that officially kind of closes out the webinar. We do have a little bit of time. Let us use that. Do you want to say anything? We'll take a look at some questions here.
Yeah, let's take a look at the questions. You can, while Kevin's doing that, the website he's referring to is the DonorVoice.com, and as he said at the start, and I said, we'll send you, he'll send you the information from this study, and Tom and I will also have some views on it on the agitator on Thursday, and I appreciate very much everyone's coming to this. And Kevin, what do you have there? And
Let's see, one quick question. The organizations who provided data, were these only donors who gave online or all donors active for 3 years? So no, these are people for whom they had email address, and the giving occurred across different channels. And in some cases it was all direct mail giving. In some cases it could be online only. Some cases it could be both. So it was a cross-section, and therefore kind of representative of all the giving across their channel, however that sort of falls out. Let's see. There were a couple questions in here, and for whatever reason, the screen that we're looking at, just so you can appreciate our struggle here, is I don't know, maybe it's 2 centimeters where we've got to kind of scroll through, and it's probably pilot error in our inability to make the screen bigger. But at any rate, we're trying to decipher these questions 1 centimeter at a time. There were a couple questions. Let me just actually go back a couple screens. I think that violates all sorts of webinar etiquette. But about the axes on the charts. As I mentioned, there were some details that we kept out, all accessible in the white paper and various spots on the site. Some components of the commitment model. It is absolutely the case that in order to measure and create the donor commitment score, you only need the 3 questions, and it was those 3 questions. Somebody else had asked how we got scores of 93 when it was 0 to 10, and so we just have we moved all those onto a 0-100 index just because it makes it, frankly, kind of more palatable to look at in terms of scores. So nothing fancy there. But what we didn't show is that to do the key driver analysis, there are a couple other dimensions to the commitment model. One of them is sort of the personal connection or the emotional connection to the organization. That is one of the axes. It's the vertical axis here, so the y-axis that we're reflecting here. The other dimension that is a part of commitment, we call it functional, but it's synonymous with satisfaction or reliability, and that's the x-axis that's displayed here. So personal and functional together lead to high commitment. If they're both high, if they're both low, they're going to lead to low commitment. You can see that there will always be some donors who are higher on functional than personal, and while it's unusual, that there can be small subsets who are higher in personal than functional. So those are the 2 axes that are reflected on this graph, functional and personal connection. Again, functional on the x and personal on the y. Let me see here. We can probably address a couple more questions, but yeah, as I mentioned, kind of the logistical struggle for us is reading these 1 centimeter at a time, so it's probably going to be best served if we address these offline. There's a bunch, actually, and what we can probably do is put together a document with the questions and the responses, because it seems as though folks are weighing in on several of these, saying, yeah, that's a good question, we want to know the answer to. So rather than kind of struggle, which is what we're doing, to kind of make head or tails of the questions here, let us promise to do that. We'll take a look at all the questions that have been asked, and we'll put together a summary document and send that around to everybody who registered.
Okay, well, Kevin, thank you very much. Fascinating stuff, and thank you all for attending this webinar. And here's again the website where you can get this information, or it will be sent to you if you registered. And have a good day. I'll see you on the agitator.
Thanks, everybody.